as active as I normally am at in-person conferences. It was just, I think, harder to, like, you had to do a lot of work, I guess, to go to one of those QA sessions in terms of
right. There's
stuff. So
you don't know what you're gonna get, so like you better have a question. It's like basically you have to session chair every talk, every QA session you want to go to. You have to like have that in mind.
Yeah, exactly. So I could only do like 1 or 2 per session.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I was constantly playing catch up and like, all right, we watch a bunch of talks.
Is my screen showing up?
Yep.
Right.
We'll probably wait a few more minutes for people to show up.
Sounds great.
So welcome everyone to the NLP seminar. And today our guest is Mohit, and he's an assistant professor in computer science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And his research focuses broadly on designing machine learning models for discourse level language generation. And his group also works on tasks involving creative language understanding. And today he's going to talk about towards human in the loop story generation. So let's welcome Mohit.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking mainly about a data set and evaluation method for human in the loop story generation. So there's not going to be a lot of modeling stuff. Hope that doesn't disappoint some of you. Okay, so oh, hang on, let me move this thing. All right, so yeah, there's been a lot of recent work in the NLP community over the past year or 2 on this task of story generation, and kind of broadly defined, you're asking a model to produce some sort of narrative given an input prompt or some sort of context. So as one example, there's this writing prompt subreddit. Some of you might have seen this. It's become a data set that's been used in the NLP community, where you have these very short prompts. So here's one: flowers have become so rare that they're the most sought after items in the world, sold at high prices in black markets, under guard in national museums, etc. You just stumbled upon across a natural rose. And then like people on the subreddit write stories that kind of follow this prompt. So you can imagine training a model to do something similar. So here is the beginning of the highest upvoted story on the subreddit. You can see, so I'm not going to read all of this, but if you do look through it, you'll notice that this story kind of follows some common themes and components that are sort of true of good and enjoyable stories across the board. The first paragraph here is kind of describing the setting of the story. So we're in this like desert environment, there's dead trees, and it's unusual to see like something alive here in the dry earth. The next part of the story introduces the main character, this first person narrator, I, and then we have some more details about the setting. There's some more information about other characters, right? Introducing this village of rusted huts. Clearly things are not going well here. Kids are trying to eat weeds and stuff. And then at the end, we have this kind of hook or new concept that's introduced, this biodome, right? So what would a biodome pay for this rose that I've found? So it kind of sets the tone. We know that this is probably going to have some sort of sci-fi-ish element, and it really kind of gets you more interested to learn about, you know, what is this biodome and so on. So these are kinds of things that you'll see throughout stories that are written by actual humans. So if you put this prompt into GPT-2, which is one of our, you know, large, formerly state-of-the-art language models, you get the following, which is, it contains none of these things that you would expect from a story, but rather sort of turns more into advice on taking care of plants or choosing flowers, and then it generates these links here, which are not actually real links. So this is just not a good story, right? So the task here from the NLP perspective is to generate a story that kind of looks like a reasonable story, has all of these components, and is enjoyable to read. At least that's how we motivate this work within NLP. But of course, if you think about it, this task is really hard. So one thing in particular that makes this task different than things like summarization or translation is that it's very unconstrained. So you could imagine like thousands of different plausible, enjoyable stories that come out of that single prompt about finding a rose, right? And this kind of makes training a model difficult if you only have one example of a story or a few examples of a story that follow from a prompt. But it makes evaluation even more difficult, right? I can't do any of the things that I would do in, say, translation, right? Where I can compare to some reference story, because this is just so unconstrained that there is no telling whether the generated story even follows the same plot as the reference story. So evaluation is very hard as well, which makes making progress on this task difficult, because it's really unclear how to compare different models and know which ones are doing better than another if we don't even have a way of quantifying what better means. So another kind of unique aspect to story generation is this very long-term and high-level planning process. So if you imagine you were writing a story, you probably have some idea of what the important events that are going to happen in the future is, or at least some of the important themes that you want to express through your narrative, or things like character development and so on. Our models currently are just, these kind of autoregressive language models. They produce one word at a time, and they don't really have any sort of high-level notion of concepts that they're planning in the future. I mean, there have been some strides in this regard, but fundamentally, I don't think we've made any huge improvements. So another difference from other generation tasks is that in some cases, stories can be really long, right? Imagine generating a whole novel. This is completely beyond what we can do today, even probably with GPT-3, although I guess that's to be determined. And finally, stories have all sorts of complicated linguistic phenomena compared to more standard newswire text, right? We have things like metaphor, figurative language, in addition to all of the high-level narrative arcs and character development that you don't really see in other domains. So the task is very hard, but as I mentioned before, a lot of people are working on it, which is great. I don't think we could just give up and not do anything related to this task. And so I've highlighted a couple of papers here, but there have been many more recently. So I wanted to highlight a couple things about the prior work. First is that there's no standard data set for story generation. So all three of these papers that I've highlighted here use a different data set. The work by Angela Finn uses this writing prompts data that we looked at earlier in the talk. So this consists, again, of very short prompts, and there's really no constraints on what a Redditor can write in response. Then on the other end of the scale, there's rock stories, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that consists of these 5-sentence long stories that are created by crowd workers. So here, the crowd workers are not really incentivized to tell enjoyable stories, and really what can you do within a limitation of 5 sentences? Probably not that much. So you get very simplified not only language, but also like plots, right? You know, whatever you can express in 5 sentences. And so it's unclear if advances made on this data set are actually scalable to more realistic narratives. So yeah, the data is a problem. There's this balance between how simulated the data set is versus like the sort of constraints and supervision that you can give your model, which is kind of lacking in the writing prompts data set. Another major issue that we've touched on before is evaluation. So automatic evaluation, there was this recent paper by Abigail C. on different ways that we can evaluate generated stories automatically. And there are a couple of key questions that you would want to evaluate if you have a story generation model, right? You want to know, was the text that it generated related to the prompt? Was it coherent? Was there, you know, some diversity and syntactic complexity perhaps in the generated stories? And then there's also larger questions, right? Like, is this an enjoyable story? These are kind of more vague and probably impossible to formalize in an automatic setting. The conclusion of this paper, or one of the conclusions, was that the only reliable way to assess overall text quality for generated stories is human evaluation. But if we turn to human evaluation, it is actually very hard to set up a human evaluation for story generation. So we can look at a couple of the papers that I mentioned before and how they evaluate using humans, and most prior work focuses on these kind of mechanical-turked crowdsourced evaluations. And in doing so, you basically give there are a lot of constraints on how you can evaluate a generated story. So for one thing, crowd workers are not going to read a huge amount of text, right? If you give them like a chapter of a novel that your model generated, there's no way you're going to be able to evaluate that using Mechanical Turk without paying an insane amount of money. Also, it's very unclear how, even if setting the issue of like length aside, what kinds of questions are you going to ask these workers? And you know, questions like, is this story relevant to a particular prompt? Those are at least a little more concrete, but asking someone how enjoyable is this story is very subjective. So it's not clear that this is really a useful question to ask, even if you could ask it. Also, if you look at the prior work, you'll see that their human evaluations are kind of at a surface level. So this evaluation from Angela Fan is mainly looking at the relevance of the prompt to the story. So you give a crowd worker 3 prompts and 3 generated stories and ask them to match up the prompt with the story. But of course, a model can be great at this task, but still produce completely unenjoyable stories, right, of low quality. And similarly, in this other paper, the Yao et al. Paper, this is comparing the output of 2 different models. So you're going to ask a Mechanical Turk worker to pick which story is better. But you know, if both models are garbage, then this isn't really telling you anything about you know, are the generated stories actually going to be useful or enjoyable to a human reader? So I say all of this to motivate our setting, which is human in the loop storytelling. So this kind of differs from the story generation setting that we've explored to this point, in that we not only have a prompt, but we also have a human author that's engaging with the text of a computer model. So essentially in this setting, you have an author who's writing a story, and then at any point in their story, they can query a model for suggested text. So it could be, you know, like a generated scene that follows from the context that they've already written. Could be, you know, like a line of dialogue. Whenever the human author gets, you know, something like writer's block, they can query this model to kind of make their writing process smoother. So that's the practical motivation. But as we're going to see later in this talk, if you set up a human-in-the-loop storytelling model, you can also do a much better job of evaluating the quality of your computer model. Okay, so getting to an outline of the rest of this talk, we're going to first discuss this new data set that enables us to explore human-in-the-loop storytelling, and with an emphasis on the additional structure that we have in this data set in the form of all sorts of metadata, which makes it kind of like an easier way to set up your model for actually generating stories compared to something like writing prompts, which is very unconstrained. And once we describe the data set, we'll also look at how to actually evaluate the quality of our model generated stories using the human authors who are actually in the loop. Okay, and so all of this work is done on an existing online platform called Storium. So the URL is there, you can check it out if you like. But essentially this is a collaborative story writing platform, and it's meant for people who want to write a story, like they're interested in creative writing, but they may not have the willpower or the ability to write a story all by themselves. So on this website, you can, if you're one of these people, you can join up with other writers like you, and kind of each of you get assigned to a specific character and can write scenes from the perspective of your character, but the overall story is not entirely composed by just a single author, but rather by a group of authors who all have their own characters. So it kind of makes the writing process a lot easier. You have not only information about a character, but you also have goals and sub-goals for your character and challenges that your characters must overcome that are posed by a narrator of the story. So a lot of the planning and stuff is done for the users, which makes it easy for them to focus just on writing given a very specific prompt. And so this work was done by my PhD students, Nader and Shufan, and also with Nanyun, who is here. Okay, so I wanted to start by giving an example of a story from the Storium platform. So this story is called Inspectors Ghost Hunting for Beginners. And so if you look on the left here, you'll see these little icons that are corresponding to different characters. There's a whole cast of characters. So again, each story is written by a group of separate users. And each of the users gets assigned to one of these characters or to the narrator. So let's take a look at what the character, what kind of information you have when you join a story about your character. So this character's name is Emilia Lopez. And so she's associated with a bunch of cards. So cards are kind of like properties or attributes, abilities, items that a character has that can help them address various challenges that are put forth by the narrator. So here, Emilia has this lab technician card. So she has experience in chemical and biological labs, as well as data analysis. She's got this ability of good hearing. She has a coward attribute. She has a curiosity attribute, and so on. So all of these cards kind of provide a loose definition of her character, and the user who is assigned to this character is going to exemplify these traits in the various scenes that they write from the perspective of Emilia. Okay, so the other component here is the narrator, right? So the narrator is a separate user that doesn't write scenes from the perspective of characters, but rather comes up with challenges for these characters to solve. So if we look at this, on the right there, we see that there's this challenge called Hit the Books. And Emilia is going to address this challenge using her curiosity card or attribute. So we look closer at Hit the Books. this is the text that the narrator comes up with. So this is essentially the role of the narrator. You have your personal libraries, the internet, and the public library. Time to research what you can about werewolves. So that's the challenge. And there are two outcomes that the narrator has also outlined. So this offers each user an idea of what might happen if their character either succeeds or fails with regard to this challenge. So you can see that if the characters all succeed at this challenge, they find out how to, why a cat might start speaking in Russian. Is there some like demonic possession or something? Not really sure what this has to do with werewolves, but you know, whatever. This is a real example from the data set. And if there's a negative outcome for this challenge, you find something that's entirely wrong and may make you look like an idiot. So this is the challenge. And Emilia writes, so the user controlling Emilia writes this text in response to this challenge. So if you read this, it looks like Emilia was unable to figure out why the cat was speaking Russian. There's too much information to come to any conclusion. Okay, so zooming out, we have in our data set about 6,000 of these stories. So again, a story is associated with one group of users who are writing these scenes and addressing challenges. And I wanted to emphasize that each story can last for many years. Some stories have been going on for like 5+ years, and there's, you know, it's actually pretty amazing that the narrator can invent challenges that somehow still keep the attention and interest of all the users involved in the stories. But some of these stories are really long, like they have a lot of scenes and challenges and character development and so on. The site has a fairly active user base. There's about 30,000 users, and the data set is quite large. So there's about 150,000 of these player cards. So these are like the attributes or properties of the characters. There's 60,000 unique challenges that have been addressed, and these challenges have been written about in about 450,000 scene entries. So again, a scene entry is like what one character writes addressing a particular challenge. The number of tokens, if you're interested in that kind of information, is 125 million tokens. So it's not huge compared to something like Wikipedia or, of course, the Common Crawl, but it's not very small either. And the average tokens per scene entry is about 250. So each individual scene entry is kind of on the order of a paragraph long. So that's kind of the data set that we're working with. And we did a like topic modeling type analysis. I just wanted to give some quick highlights. Basically, as you might expect from an online storytelling forum, most of the stories are fantasy and science fiction. There's stories about, you know, temples and caves and tombs and demons and dragons and spacecraft and so on. So this is the majority of our data, but there are, you know, some domains and worlds that are different. Okay, so right, if we zoom out even more, compared to something like rock stories or writing prompts, why do we think this data set, like what are its merits, right? And so one major one is that these stories are written by people who are hugely invested in the stories, right? Some of them have been at this for years, and they're authors who, some of them have a goal of publishing what they write. So they're, you know, they're invested beyond just a single story. They want to improve their writing skills. So you can imagine how the quality of these stories on average is significantly higher than what you would expect if you ask, you know, a mechanical Turker to write a story addressing a particular prompt. Okay, compared to the writing prompts subreddit, which you could argue has, the users have many of the same motivations as Storium users, we have all this additional metadata, which makes it super interesting from a modeling perspective, right? The scene entries here are much more constrained than like a story on the writing prompt subreddit, because we have, associated with each scene, what is the challenge being addressed? There are some things that I haven't even shown you, like goals and sub-goals of a particular character. There's information about locations, and there's all this rich prior history about how all the characters have interacted with each other on previous challenges and so on. So it's a much more constrained task than the writing prompts data, which makes it more feasible to actually train suitable models for it. One thing that I won't talk about here, because we haven't done it yet, but we are planning to do it, is our data set also allows us to model the decisions of the narrator, right? So if you remember, the narrator is the one coming up with these challenges, deciding what the biographies of these characters are and what attributes they have. And they're responsible for the high level, like, narrative arc of the whole story. So they're kind of incentivized to make the story go in a direction that's as enjoyable as possible to not only the users, the authors of the story, but also anyone who's reading the story. So this is a kind of some type of data that's not available in other data sets, and actually allows us, or will allow us, hopefully, to model the high level planning process. All right. So the other thing I want to talk about is how do we evaluate using the Storium platform. So far I've just talked about the data set, but remember that Storium is an active platform with real users who are writing stories every day. So we collaborated with the developers of Storium, who allowed us very generously to put our models on the Storium platform. So when a user goes to write their next entry, if you go there now, you can, as a user, you can click a button that, given all of the context, like the current challenge, the current card, some history of the prior, like what happened in the story, it basically queries our model on one of our UMass servers and sends over a generated scene entry that's conditioned on all this context. And then users can decide, how they want to use the generated text. Like, they could keep it entirely and add new text that kind of follows on. They can delete the whole thing if they thought it was bad. They can keep parts of it, and so on. But importantly, from an evaluation perspective, this setup allows us to collect the edits that the users make to the generated text. And this eventually will allow us to devise a metric based on the user edits, which we believe is far more informative than things like Blue with respect to a single reference. And another advantage here is that we have evaluation by domain experts, like literally the authors of the stories themselves, for free. We don't have to pay the users, because for them, it's also a benefit, right? If they have writer's block or something, they can click this button and get some ideas on how to proceed. And they're not forced to use this feature, right? So if they have a couple bad experiences, we often find that users only use the feature a couple of times and then give us some feedback like, this is just not helpful enough for the way I write, or it's stylistically very different, and they don't have to use it. But other users found it actually very helpful. So we'll talk about that a bit later. All right, so I wanted to start talking about the modeling process, but really more so like, what kinds of inputs does our model see? And so we start with, from the user's perspective, right? They control a particular character. So here in this example, we have this character of Adira Makarova. And they have a current challenge, right? This is the challenge that a narrator has set forth for the particular scene. So in this case, this is a real example. The challenge is disrupt the Germans. And so you're supposed to bomb the German marshalling yard. Searchlights are active, so there's some description of the setting. And there's also this interesting instruction from the narrator. The last character to play must play a weak card, which means the narrator is going to hope that this challenge fails. So they're going to reach this failed outcome. So remember that the narrator is the one who devises, who specifies how the story will move forward based on what the entries of the characters. So they provide both a successful outcome, in this case, you score good hits and damage is minimal, and a failed outcome where one plane is out of action and one character is wounded, and the narrator gets to choose who's wounded. So this gives you some more insight into how much control the narrator has over the story. So our model gets this as well, the character biography, the challenge, the success and failed outcome, and also then the user has to pick, which of her attributes is she going to use to address this challenge. And so this user picked the deadly aim card, which says you're a crack shot. So it seems to be a positive attribute for this challenge. So it seems like this user is going to write an entry that is in favor of the successful outcome here. And finally, our model gets access to the introductory text of the scene, which is also written by the narrators. So here it's talking about the women were called to the flight line, the leader of the section called out assignments, and so on. So this is the context that our model sees. So at a high level, our model takes all of this input context and produces a generated entry. So this is actually a real generated entry from our model, given this particular context. I'm not going to read it to you, but it is kind of relevant to all of the things that were discussed in that context. But then the more interesting part is that once this generated text is sent to the user can make any edits that they want. So this is a generated scene, and the user can interact with this in any way they please. And after they're done, they send us back their final edited version of the scene. So we collect all of their edits. So if we look at this example in particular, we see that this user, so the yellow text here is text that they've preserved from the generated text. So they thought this text was good enough or enjoyable enough, or they liked the ideas in it, and so they kept it in their final scene. And the red text is text that they generated, that they deleted. So here you see that they deleted this entire clause here, and then she would take over as pilot while she made calls from other pilots. Maybe it was a little repetitive. And the green text is stuff that they add. So here they added this disrupting the Germans, which is kind of more relevant to the challenge. They deleted this whole portion and added a more generic statement. It was time to shine, and so on. So they can do whatever they want, right? They could delete the whole thing if they want and write something else. And then in that case, this, what we show would just be like all red deleted text and then all green new text. Okay, so given this kind of information on the edits, we are going to start forming our evaluation. But just to be in line with prior work, we also collect feedback scores on a Likert scale. So after they complete making all the edits that they want, they're asked to fill out this feedback form, which asks them on a scale of 1 to 5, how fluent is the generated text? How relevant is it to the prompt? How coherent is it? And finally, how enjoyable is it? So we collect all of these judgments as well, and this will allow us eventually to draw correlations between these various properties like fluency and relevance to the edit behavior that the users have. All right. So a quick word about the models that we use. It's essentially just fine-tuning a GPT-2 medium model. So we take the pre-trained model and we feed it all of these different types of contexts. So one sort of difference is that we have added these segment embeddings. So each segment here corresponds to a particular type of context, right? The green here is associated with challenge text. The yellow is associated with character, background text, and so on. And so when we deploy this model, we receive all of these types of context from the Storium platform, and we send back the scene entry. So this is what the user has, this is what we send to the user, and they allow them to edit. So we experimented with a bunch of different configurations of the same framework. We had another model where we tried to add some history information to the context. So currently in this model, we only have information about the current scene, right? The current challenge and the current card that is being used to address that challenge, but we have no knowledge of what happened previously in the story. So in this version, we have information about the challenge, the scene that immediately preceded the current scene. But as I mentioned before, some of these stories are incredibly long, right? So if there's like thousands of different scenes, then it's going to be very hard for us to fit everything into GPT-2's maximum token limit of 1024. So something I'm not going to talk about here is we also developed a way to kind of efficiently pack all of these types of context into that fixed 1024 token window by prioritizing certain types of context over others that we thought were more important. But yeah, really like this limitation of context size is, we believe it's drastically limiting the quality of our generated text. So that is something that we're planning to look at for future work. All right, so let's get to the results here. So we did a preliminary analysis to just make sure that adding this history information about the previous challenge is actually useful. So here we weren't looking at the edits at all. We were just looking at these feedback scores. And so here the top row is just the GPT-2 medium. It's fine-tuned on the current scene, but not the previous scene. And then the second row has, in addition to the current scene, also information about the previous scene. So you can see that the relevance improves as does the coherence when you have more context. The perplexity slightly goes down. But again, we don't really know if these results correlate to the edits. But this was kind of a preliminary experiment, and we decided for all of the future experiments that face users at a larger scale to go with this model that included the history of the previous scene as well.
Please note that your call, including
Okay, so now I want to get to the actual edits, right? So we want some way to quantify the different types of edits that the users make. Intuitively, we feel that edits that have fewer changes, so like fewer additions or deletions, deletions in particular, should receive a higher score than edits where, say, the user deleted the entire generated scene and wrote their own thing. Because if they preserved some parts of the generated text, this is a pretty strong indication that the generated text was useful, right? So our metric that we use is very similar to Rouge LCS, which is the longest common subsequence. We make a couple modifications to this. So essentially, this is measuring the length of the longest common subsequence between the edited text and the generated text, and then normalizing by the length of the generated text. But importantly, the longest common subsequence computation here does not mean that it has to be a contiguous subsequence. So they could, insert things in between parts of the generated text, and it would still count as preserving text. So we do a few things that are kind of specific to our setting. So one is we disallow any unigram stop word matches in the LCS computation. We also, when we're considering contiguous substrings like n-grams, we remove any that consist completely of stop words. So they have to have at least one stop word, one non-stop word. And this is because we found that in the story generation task, a lot of the things that contributed to the LCS computation were associated with like very frequent bigrams or trigrams that didn't really contain any like heavy semantic or meaningful words. So I mean, our metric is very similar to Rouge LCS, but we call it user for user story edit ratings. Essentially, again, it's measuring how much of the story that the user, how much of the generated story that the user preserved in their final story. So then we went and we did a large scale analysis by deploying our model to the Storium platform. And so we collected these edits over a period of a couple months. Again, this is a pretty slow process because it is a lot of work for a user to, actually go in and write a scene entry, right? It takes time. It's not like they're only giving us Likert judgments. So on average, without this feature, each user was producing about one entry a week. And so that's why it took quite a long time to get up to hundreds of edits. One thing that we had a tough time evaluating just qualitatively was what kind of decoding algorithm to use for our generation. And this is because there's several proposed ways of improving diversity and maintaining coherence, decreasing repetition, right? The two most common ones are top K sampling and nucleus sampling. Qualitatively, we could see that doing something like a beam search just resulted in very generic text, but we had a hard time telling between these two sampling strategies. So we decided to evaluate both of them on our platform. So we collected about 200 edits from each of these decoding strategies using that model that included the history information from the prior scene that I described before. And interestingly, we found that top K sampling is significantly better across all of the feedback ratings as well as the user metric, which measures the edits. So in particular, the relevance and coherence of the feedback ratings is higher with top K sampling, and the user metric is significantly higher as well. There's obviously each of these methods has some hyper parameters, like what value for K do you use, or what value of P do you use for nucleus sampling. We kind of just went with the like what people had done for prior story generation work and didn't vary these parameters because, again, it's very expensive to collect edits for any configuration. So we can't really do a hyperparameter search over these feedback scores and user metric. So we kind of just went with what was most accepted in the prior work here. Okay, so one interesting thing that we can do now that we have both this user metric and these feedback scores is measure how much the feedback scores correlate with the edits that are made. So these are Pearson correlations between the feedback scores and the user, the feedback scores with themselves and also with the user metric. And so I wanted to highlight two things here. One is that relevance, out of all of the feedback scores, relevance correlates most strongly with the edit metric. And this makes sense. A lot of the time, our model fails to generate text that's relevant to either the current challenge or to the story, like the larger story. And in those cases, it's because it doesn't even have access to scenes that were well in the past. So when our model happens to generate something that is actually relevant, it's likely to have a higher user metric as well. So users are likely to sort of keep the text that is produced by the model. Another thing is that fluency is not really correlated at all with the user metric. And basically this is because GPT-2 is almost always generating fluent text. So fluency doesn't tell you much about how enjoyable or how much text the user is going to preserve of the generated suggestion, because it's just not relevant if all of the generated text is fluent. All right, so finally, I wanted to get into some of the qualitative observations that we had. We ran about 10 interviews with Storium users after they had contributed their edits. There were a couple of themes that emerged that were common to many of these users. One is that many of the users prefer not to copy over whole sentences, but rather use short phrases. Oftentimes they keep entities, and actually one thing was interesting in many of the interviews, some of the users mentioned that the model's ability to like hallucinate new names of characters was very useful, because coming up with the names is actually quite difficult for authors. And so they thought that that was, it was kind of sad for us to hear that this was one of the most useful things from our that our model could do, because it's not really related to the content of the generated text. But yeah, users in general prefer to keep very short phrases from the generated text, and they often, because it's not very relevant most of the time, they take the generated text in a completely different direction. Another thing we found was that the first few generated sentences are much more likely to be preserved than the later ones. So this also kind of makes sense if you're familiar with the behavior of these language models, right? They start to kind of go off on a tangent or generate random stuff after a couple of sentences. So this is a good sanity check that we could see that the first sentence is much more likely to be preserved. Something that was sad was that actually most of the time users, like the most common behavior we observed was users delete the entire generated text. So it was just too bad. There was nothing remotely redeeming about the generated text, and they write their own thing. So this was sad, but it is an area of future improvement, obviously. Okay, so we also collected feedback, like personalized feedback for a particular scene entry from different users, and we got some pretty interesting feedback. So this one I thought was pretty funny. The AI gives me ideas for keeping things going. For example, I was gonna just say they slay the big golem, but then the machine came up with there was 3 golems, so I had to keep going and rethink the story. I just kept the writing because I liked what I was doing. Every time the AI changed the story, I just worked with it like a friend giving me ideas. So this is like what we were aiming for. So it was nice to see that this particular user at least found it useful in this regard. We had a lot of instances of users trying out this feature, like just to see what it would do. This user says, it was hilarious, bad, and amazing at the same time. There were some concerns about like strong language, inappropriate stuff that was coming through. And sometimes it was not at all relevant to the context. So some of the games in this data set are like they have this over 18 tag and may contain writing like this. So our model was conditioned on this data set. This is something we kind of like blacklisted certain words in our final version, but of course that's not sufficient to remove this kind of thing. So it is something that needs to be looked at in the future. We had some very interesting kind of descriptions of the various AIs. So we didn't tell people that there were different models being evaluated, but I think people started to figure that out. And this person like tried to, like they used the feature a lot, and enough so that they thought that there were 3 different models that were developed, and each of them had their own like personalities and styles. So that was interesting as well. All right, so just to start wrapping up here, moving forward, we're planning to release the Storium dataset to researchers interested in building story generation models. But maybe more importantly, we are also releasing this evaluation platform. So you can build a model and submit it to us, and we will host it on our servers and have Storium users directly able to query your models and get it evaluated through their edits. So all you have to do is write like 4 different methods. There's a very simple API. Again, the Storium users won't know what model is being used, so that ensures some sort of fair evaluation. And at the end of the day, we want this to be kind of a leaderboard for human-in-the-loop generation, where you can directly compare different models. I mean, provided you have enough edits for each one. And hopefully this will enable this whole story generation community to make actual progress over the next few years. All right, so I guess I have a few minutes left. I just wanted to close by giving a small nod to the huge engineering effort that this has been. It's really probably not the ideal project for a PhD student, but building a text generation model that actually faces users and interacts with users, you have to consider a lot of things that you normally don't when you're just doing research, right? So probably the hardest thing for us to overcome was latency. So we can't, like the Storium developers told us that if it took more than 60 seconds for a user to get a generated output, they're not going to let us put it on the platform. So this took a lot of work to figure out, what is the biggest, most powerful model that we can use while still getting under this wait time and the wait time limit, and how are our wait times going to behave with different loads on the server, how many servers are we going to need, and so on. So I'm not going to talk more about this in the talk, but it was just something that if you're also thinking of deploying something to a large amount of users, it becomes really important. And in the future, that is something that we need to take into consideration when we're trying to improve our models. So if we want models that produce more relevant text, one thing that we likely have to do is increase the context size beyond 1024 tokens. We've brainstormed a couple ways to get around this, like the GPU limitations, the memory limitations, but everything we do has to also keep latency in mind, right? The more complex we make our model, the slower it likely becomes. And so some of my other students are looking at faster, more efficient generation architectures that can be scaled over huge contexts without incurring huge slowdowns. All right, so I guess with that, I will conclude and take questions if there's time.
Somebody trying to unmute just me? Well, does anybody have any questions? No. If not, I can ask one, but I'd like to, I have a half hour with Mohit. So.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, Mohit. This is Melissa Romley. I was really curious about the result that you said was fairly common, where there was no n-gram overlap between the suggested text and the user-edited text. Do you have a sense of whether that means that the user just completely ignored what was generated, or do you think there's any possibility that it's still influenced?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we discussed this a lot while developing this work, and I think maybe even some of your work has ways of like asking this question to the user. We actually had one of our proposed feedback options was, did the generated text influence you or something like that in writing your final entry? But we weren't quite sure how to phrase this, and there was a little bit of pushback by the Storium developers as well. They thought it was kind of vague. This is definitely something that is a plausible explanation for some of these deleted entries, that the generated text was useful even though there was no overlap at all. We tried to get at this in our interviews with the users a little bit, where we asked them this question, but I think most of the 10 users said that this was rarely happening, and they were mainly focused on things like entities or short phrases. like because they like the language and not because of anything related to the content. But yeah, I'm not sure how, like, we struggled with phrasing this question, and that's why I didn't make it in there.
Sure, sure. Cool. Thanks.
Again, anybody else have any questions? I'm happy to fill the time, but I'd rather let somebody else ask a question if they've got one.
I had a question.
Go for it.
Hey, this is Joel. So in the user metric that you introduced here, one aspect that I'm kind of curious is, in some of the examples that you showed, there were rephrasings of the generated text. So that is not really accounted for.
Yes, that's correct. So that's another limitation of, I mean, really anything that relies on exact word matching. Again, like this was something that we tried to get at in our interviews, where we asked, you know, was the text useful even if you deleted it? But we didn't see that there was any, well, at least from the users that we interviewed, none of them mentioned this kind of paraphrasing behavior. That's not to say that it didn't occur, and it likely does occur to some extent, but at least with our current model, just by looking through all of the edits that we have, I don't think that this occurs to a significant degree. But I do agree that, yeah, ideally we would account for it in our metric, and possibly some of the newer metrics like blurt or whatever, however you pronounce that, could be adapted to this setting. So that might be useful to look into in the future.
Thanks.
This is George Cooper speaking. I was curious if you had done any work toward incorporating the user edits somehow back into the model rather than just as input to the evaluation metric.
Yeah, so when we started, we were hoping that we could do this, but then we ran into the very real problem of it takes users a long time to produce any of these entries. And so we had to dramatically lower the expected number of edits that we would receive. Finally, we got about 500 or so. I think we're actually still collecting edits. So I'm not sure how many we have right now, but yeah, it's a far cry from like thousands of different edits that you might need to fine tune your model on these things. So yeah, we are hoping that you know, through the process of publicizing this evaluation platform, we get more uptick on the Storium user base itself. I mean, this is one of the primary reasons why the Storium developers even allowed us to put our models on their platform. And so if we have more users interacting with this feature and better models, then eventually, hopefully we can collect some sort of data set that allows us to further fine tune our models and the edits. But at this point, we don't feel like we have enough data.
That makes sense, thanks.
All right, if there are no more questions, then let's conclude the seminar. And thank you, Mohit, for the very interesting talk.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.